Jeff Kowalczyk, and today I'm going to be talking about 5 ways to reduce your organization's risk of fraud. Probably an important place to start would be to provide a basic definition of fraud for our purposes, and I'm going to use the definition from Black's Law Dictionary, which defines fraud as a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or concealment of a material fact to induce another to act to his or her detriment. It's important to remember that fraud can be conducted by an individual or a group, either internal to or external to the organization. It could also be a combination of both internal and external parties. In the academic study of fraud, there is a concept called the fraud triangle, which suggests that there are 3 elements that are required as preconditions for a fraud to exist. Those 3 elements are pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. The first one, pressure, can be either internal as part of an organization or a personal external pressure. So an internal pressure might be if an accountant is under a lot of pressure to show a project as having turned a profit or an income. An external pressure might be someone struggling to make ends meet because of gambling debts. Opportunity is quite simply a lapse in internal controls or some other situation which creates the opportunity for an individual to basically commit the fraud and not get caught or not get caught in a timely manner. And then finally, the rationalization is more of an internal matter, and that is basically a situation where the person who commits the fraud is somehow able to convince themselves that it was appropriate. And where you see that a lot is if somebody feels they're underpaid or that everybody else is doing it, then that can be a rationalization to commit the fraud. So pressure, there isn't necessarily a lot we can do to get rid of most pressures. A lot of pressures are external. Obviously, when you're working with people, you want to not place unreasonable burdens on them. But a lot of the pressure is external to the organization, so there's only so much you can do to reduce that. And with rationalization, you see a lot of that the same as well. A lot of the rationalizations are internal to an individual. So most of where we focus on is reducing the opportunity. So that is going to be a lot of structuring the organization in a way that a single individual is not able to have an undue influence in such a way that they would be able to commit a fraud. And while that is most of our focus, I'm actually going to start with one element that does pertain to rationalization. That'll be the first of our 5 sections. But before we jump into that, I just do want to go a little bit into how fraud affects the not-for-profit industry in particular. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners does a report on occupational fraud and abuse every other year, and the 2016 report provided some information that is of interest to not-for-profit organizations. About 10% of the victim organizations in their survey were not-for-profit organizations, and the median loss due to fraud in nonprofit organizations was about $100,000 in 2016, actually down slightly from $108,000 from the 2014 survey. On average, a fraud lasts for 18 months prior to its detection. However, controls such as management review and data monitoring and analysis were shown to result in a 50% reduction in average loss and a 50% reduction in the average time the fraud was occurring before it was caught. So in those cases, you saw likely a decrease from about 24 months to about 12 months, well below the average loss before detection. So the question then becomes, what can we as an organization do to reduce our risk of fraud? And the good news is that there are a lot of things that you can do as an organization to reduce your risk, and that they can be done at all different levels of the organization. So first, I'm going to talk about something that relates to the governance level as well as the management level, and that is establishing a proper tone at the top. So when you think about an organization and its culture, that is defined very much by the board of directors and senior management. And they have not only the ability, but also the responsibility to establish the culture. And there are a lot of formal and informal ways that they can do that. Obviously, informally, practice what you preach. Just make sure that you are behaving in a way that you would want your employees to behave. But also, you want to ensure that you have formal policies in place, things like a code of conduct and a whistleblower policy, which are important, but obviously not enough if you as a board or as management are circumventing controls, kind of playing loose with the rules. If employees see that, then they are going to emulate that, and then you have a situation where you have a much higher risk of fraudulent activity in your organization. Another step that can be taken is to establish appropriate internal controls for all financial activities. Strong internal controls are quite possibly the most important tool an organization has to reduce the opportunity for fraud. As we discussed with the fraud triangle, if opportunity is reduced, the overall risk for fraud is similarly greatly reduced. So with large organizations, it can be easier to establish appropriate internal controls, but when you have a small organization with a limited number of people, you may need to be a little creative about how you segregate incompatible duties. So you don't want one individual in charge of collecting checks, depositing the checks, entering that information into your accounting software, and reconciling the bank statement, if at all possible. To ensure that you have those segregation of duties, if you don't necessarily have enough accounting staff to do that, perhaps you have a board member open the bank statement, or a volunteer has to sign off on all check receipts in addition to the personnel. There's a few different things you can do that really depend on your organization's structure to help reduce any of those areas where you may not be able to segregate duties naturally based on the personnel that you have in the accounting department. So the other thing to remember is that those internal controls, once you've established them, they need to evolve when your organization changes. One of the things we see sometimes is internal controls are established and they just stay. You may have a personnel policy, an accounting manual that's 10, 15, 20 years old because it was a big hassle to put the controls together, so they live as they were at that point in time. And you really want to make sure that your controls are evolving as your organization does. Your organization has probably changed a lot in the last 5 years, and it may be possible that you have some opportunities to improve your internal controls, or you may be doing things that aren't necessary. So you're really going to want to make evaluation and restructuring of internal controls as needed part of your regular activities as an organization. A third thing that might seem obvious, but we do see a lot of this, is enforcing password controls. A lot of organizations put significant emphasis on having all of their accounting and other relevant software password protected, but then we'll go into the organization's building and we'll see that everybody has their passwords on a sticky note sitting on their monitor. And if you have that, well, it's good that you have a password in case maybe a laptop got lost, but there's certainly still a significant opportunity for somebody to log on as that person at their terminal and do some damage to your organization, or try to hide if they have done something inappropriate previously. In addition to ensuring that the password is not readily available, what we generally recommend is that passwords should be complex and changed regularly. It can be a struggle, we know, to change regular passwords, but there are some things you can do. So one thing you can do is establish a set of parameters, such as you need one capital letter, one lowercase letter, one number, one special character, and then let each individual set their passwords. That way they are more likely to remember them. The other thing you can do is establish complex passwords that follow a specific format, and then you either change the format or you change part of the password. And when I say change the format, what you might have is a passphrase where the first three letters are capital, the last three letters are capital, and all E's are replaced with threes. And maybe the next month you change it so that the second, fourth, and sixth letters are capital, and instead of E's becoming threes, I's become ones. That way it's the same passphrase, and you just have to remember what has been altered as far as uppercase, lowercase. What that also means is if somebody does leave a sticky note on, it is not the actual password. They can just leave a sticky note saying what this month's character cipher is. And that way they can remind themselves without giving away the password. So having established a proper tone at the top and established appropriate controls within your organization, the next thing you want to do is support those on the front line, the employees that are behaving appropriately. The first thing you can do is if you ever receive a whistleblower claim, take it seriously and fully investigate. You want to make sure that those in the organization know that you take all claims seriously and will ensure that any bad actors are weeded out. Beyond that, you want to make sure that adherence to policies and procedures of your organization are considered a positive factor in employee evaluations. You don't, even though it is something where you want to assume everybody's going to do the right thing, you also want to reward that behavior because it is appropriate, good behavior. And you want to make sure that they understand that that is of value to your organization. The other thing that might be assistance to you is developing and publicizing a fraud hotline. What this will do is it'll provide a solid method for someone outside the organization, such as a vendor, to report any suspicious activity they may see. There are a number of companies that offer fraud hotline services at reasonable costs, and there are also various online systems that can be implemented at very little cost that will provide you some level of assurance. My final recommendation, perhaps the least palatable of the 5, is to seek out your weaknesses. Remember that protection from fraud is a moving target, and as your organization grows and changes, so do your risks and the actions you need to take to mitigate those risks. When evaluating, be sure to not include just management, just the board, but also those at all levels of the organization, as well as people outside the organization. That could include vendors that you work with on a regular basis. It could include your independent accountant, independent auditor, as well as legal counsel if you have a legal counsel. Could also include end users, people receiving your organization's services. Thing to remember is that every dollar that isn't lost to fraud is a dollar that's available to achieve your program goals. So in conclusion, fraud risks are inherent to all organizations, but can be significantly reduced. The board of directors and management have the ability and the responsibility to significantly affect the organization's culture and, by extension, its risk of fraud. Individuals from all levels of the organization, as well as from outside the organization, can play an important role in reducing the risk of fraud. Finally, fraud risks are always changing, meaning that risk assessment and response is an ongoing activity. Thank you and have a wonderful day.